With Sakal being freezing, it's more important than ever to know how clothing insulation works in DayZ. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how insulation values are calculated by the game and how it's much more complicated than the simple text insulation values we can see. We all know that we can hover over an item and see its insulation value, but under the hood, DayZ is doing a calculation to determine an exact numeric insulation value of each piece of clothing. For the purposes of this video, I developed a mod that displays the exact numeric insulation value for a piece of clothing, so we can see exactly how different factors impact insulation ratings. Here's the formula in the DayZ game code for how item insulation is calculated. It's heat isolation multiplied by wet factor multiplied by health factor, and that gives us the insulation value. Let's break down each one of these in detail. Heat isolation is the constant default numeric insulation rating for each piece of clothing in the game files. It ranges from 0 being none to 1 being the highest level possible. In official DayZ anyway, it could be modded on community servers. Now let's talk about the wet factor. Wet factor is a multiplier based on how wet the item is. You can see the numbers here in the game code and in the table. A dry item has a multiplier of 1, so no change on the insulation value. But for example, a wet item has a wet factor multiplier of 0.5. So an otherwise perfect item will provide half as much insulation if it's wet. Notice that a drenched item has a wet factor multiplier of negative 0.15. Remember that a drenched item is actively cooling you. It's important to keep in mind that your clothing loses insulation as it gets wetter, compounding the effects of snowstorms. Remember that heavy snow in DayZ does cause your clothing to get wet. Finally, let's discuss how item health impacts insulation values. The health factor is a multiplier based on the health of the item. For example, as you can see in the game code and in the table, a damaged piece of clothing provides 80% of the insulation that a pristine piece of clothing provides, and a ruined piece of clothing provides no insulation whatsoever. Now, if we put it all together, we can see the three factors in action. For example, a dry and pristine winter hunting jacket has a heat insulation value of 1, a wet factor of 1 because it's dry, and a health factor of 1 because it's pristine. 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1, obviously. The 1.0 insulation value translates to the best insulation text value we see in the game. Here are the ranges of how the numeric insulation values translate to the text values we see on the item status tooltip. 0.08 and above is best insulation. 0.61 to 0.8 is high, and so on. Anything below 0.2, including 0.2, is bad insulation. Now, if we look at a wet winter hunting jacket, it has a heat isolation value of 1.0, a wet factor of 0.5 since it's wet, and a health factor of 1.0 since it's pristine. 1 times 0.5 times 1 equals 0.5, and that translates to the medium insulation text value. Now, if we damage the jacket, it will have a heat isolation value of 1.0, a wet factor of 0.5, it's still wet, but a health factor of 0.8 because it's damaged. 1 times 0.5 times 0.8 equals 0.4, or a low insulation value. In addition to all of this, there are two additional things that need to be kept in mind. Since the text value we see in the game includes a range of actual numeric insulation values, it's possible for two items with the same text value to have different underlying numeric insulation values. For example, even though the padded gloves and wool gloves are both best insulation, the padded gloves have a numeric value of 1, while the wool gloves have a numeric value of 0.89, rounded up to 9 here in the video. The actual insulation value for the wool gloves is 10% worse than the padded gloves. Maybe 10% isn't enough of a difference to worry about, but it's something to be aware of. Also, as of version 1.26, some clothing variants have different insulation values. For example, the hunting jacket has different values for each variant. The summer hunting jacket has the worst insulation with a rating of 0.30, while the winter hunting jacket has the best rating of 1.0. The hunting jacket, hunting pants, patrol jacket, and patrol pants all have different insulation ratings for different variants as of DayZ version 1.26. So, when you're battling the elements on Sakal or any other map, consider the default heat isolation rating, the wetness factor, the item's health, and don't forget about the item's variance for certain pieces of clothing. There's a page on thisisloot.com which explains all of this in detail and has tables where you can look up the exact heat isolation ratings for each piece of clothing. If you found this to be helpful and want to see more similar videos, be sure to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel.